G'day guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Kaitlyn and I'm an American learning to live down under here in beautiful Sydney, Australia. So if you've seen a couple of my videos before, you're probably catching on that my voice is just a little bit scratchy. Mark and I just came back from Hawaii and we caught a travel cold towards the end of our trip. Luckily it's not COVID, it's definitely not monkeypox. So luckily it's just a cold. I'm getting over the last bit of it. So sorry if my throat is a little bit scratchy, but it's been a while and I wanted to film this for you guys, fresh coming back from Hawaii. And these are reverse culture shocks. Culture shocks going from Australia to Hawaii and then all the way back to Australia. Obviously Hawaii is very different from my hometown in Philly, but being back in the States, there are some things that definitely reminded me of home, good and bad. So today I'm sharing some culture shocks, reverse culture shocks, of what it's like going from Australia to America and back to Australia as an American. I know it's a lot, it's kind of a mouthful, but grab a Bicky, grab a cuppa, and let's jump right into this video. The first culture shock is how different all of the 50 states really are. So I've been to a few states along the East Coast. Not that many, I think I've only been to 8 of them, but I forgot just how different these states are from one another. My hometown of Philly is in a very northeast part of the country. You get to experience all 4 seasons. We have snow during winter. We have heat waves, which should probably make Aussies laugh if you want to call them heat waves. But it can reach 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, so roughly like 35 to 40 degrees Celsius, and that is considered a heat wave in Philly, whereas in Hawaii it's very tropical. You don't really get spring and autumn so much, you really do just get summer and winter over there. And even then, you don't really get snow. There's quite a bit of humidity. You don't get those really dry heat summers that you'll get in the southwest part of America, like Arizona and New Mexico. On top of that, the states have a different attitude. There's different feelings in each environment. Philly is a very urban city in an otherwise very rural state. A lot of people from Pennsylvania are very different to people from Philly, and you can kind of see that dichotomy between Philly and Pittsburgh and the rest of the state, which is one of the things that makes Pennsylvania a really unique state. Whereas over in Hawaii, even though there's a bunch of different islands and the islands each have a different vibe, there's still that traditional Hawaiian culture that's laced throughout all of the islands over there. Because it's such a huge tourist destination, also as part of the Hawaiian culture, it's so much more laid back over there than if you compared it to New York. So being in America was such a reminder that all 50 states are very different. They have their own feeling, their own vibe, their own culture behind it. Whereas over here in Australia, even though the states do have some differences between them, overall there's still this overarching feeling of being in Australia, no matter what state or territory you're in. It still feels like one cohesive country, even though the cities and the states do vary a little bit from each other. Sorry guys, my camera battery just died on me already and had to replace that. So the second culture shock on here is just how frustrating the tipping system is. And online you will see so many videos talking about what it's like having to learn how to tip in America, what it's like going from America to another first world country. But one of the things that was really frustrating was going over to America, looking at the bill and knowing that you now had to tip about 20% of your bill. It feels like this tipping percentage keeps going up and up and up. Obviously with inflation, food prices keep going up and up. But in the States, it's now expected that you tip your servers about 20%. And for great service, Mark and I had absolutely no problem with 20, even 25 or 30% of our bill. Some of the waiters we ran across were just absolutely wonderful, lovely people. But then there was this one waitress we had who was absolutely terrible, who should not be in the service industry whatsoever. And I'm not talking because she didn't smile or she was grouchy or anything like that. I'm talking she was just a genuinely terrible waitress. She insulted Mark at the table. She brought out raw food. And then when she had to go and take the plate back, she only took the piece of steak that was raw. It wasn't even blue. She took that off the plate, left the rest of the plate. It was an absolute mess. And on top of that, we were still expected to tip 20%, which is very frustrating if you have terrible service because you know at the end of the day, their wages, what they take home, is tied to essentially your generosity. We could have been grouchy and tipped her absolutely nothing, and she would have walked away with, I think, $2 in change as work for an hour. And that's obviously not fair to the workers, but then you also have to realize that tipping in other countries like Australia isn't expected. Tipping is for exceptional service, for waitstaff who go above and beyond. Whereas in America, you can be a terrible waitress and you're still expected that you're going to get 20% of that bill. So tipping in America, again, was so very, very frustrating. Again, there were some waiters and waitresses we had who were absolutely wonderful, and we had no problem tipping up to 30%. But there were just some wait staff, particularly this one waitress who I don't think we will ever forget, who were absolutely awful and honestly didn't deserve an extra 20%. But at the same time, they should still deserve a living wage, which obviously wait staff don't get in the States. The tips are supposed to balance that out. It is really, really frustrating going back into a tipping wait staff culture over in the States and knowing that the vast bulk of whatever money they're taking home comes from your tips and your generosity. It puts this really unnecessary pressure on a customer at the very end of a service as well. If you've had a really good meal, if you've had a really good time, but it was ruined by a not so friendly waiter or waitress, then suddenly it puts a damper at the very end when you have to go pay that bill, pay that check, whatever you want to call it at the end, and you now are expected to add on a tip on top of it. It kind of puts a sour note on what should be a really nice and pleasant experience when you go out. Now this shock is not going to come as that much of a shock to people, and that is the lack of healthy foods that are available over in the States. And I'm talking as somebody who grew up in a very large city and somebody who recently just visited Hawaii, and kind of my overall experience. Yes, there are health food shops. There are stores that sell juices for like $8. There are stores that sell salads for like $15. You can get organic produce, which is pretty much the same standard as regular produce over here in Australia. That can cost 3 to 4 times more than your regular average price of a fruit or vegetable. But besides that, again, we went to one of the biggest tourist destinations in the States. We went to Hawaii, we were in a few places, and in Honolulu. A lot of the places we went to didn't really give you that many healthy options on their menu, even the places that had a pretty large menu to begin with. If you're getting a salad in the States, unless you ask for dressing on the side, it is going to be drenched in Caesar dressing or ranch dressing. Obviously, the portion sizes are huge, but if you ask for a burger, you're going to get a huge burger and a large thing of fries. You're not going to get a side salad as an option for the most part. Over here in Australia, even if you go to a pub and order a chicken parma or parmy, whatever you want to call it, you get chicken, chips, and a salad on the side. In the States, you almost never get a salad on the side. You can pay for it as an option. Some places we went to even charged extra for a salad on the side compared to something like a baked potato, mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, etc. So even though I did put on like just 1.5 kilos of holiday weight, a lot of that came from the fact that there really were no healthy food options when we went out. There were a lot of drinks that had so much sugar in them. We went to get coffees at some places and it felt like they had dumped about 1/2 cup of sugar into each drink. And speaking of drinks, the fourth culture shock was just how generous the pours are over in America. So for the most part, drinks and shots aren't measured out at a lot of restaurants. Once you know the recipe, once you get the hang of it, they kind of essentially free pour, or they'll pour, and as they're pulling the thing away, the drink's still pouring, and next thing you know, instead of a shot, you have 1.5 shots or 2 shots. And on top of that, shot sizes in the States are a little bit bigger than they are in Australia. Mark kind of found that out the hard way our first time when we were flying over from Honolulu to Hilo. We'd stopped in a restaurant and he had gotten 2 JD and Cokes. And he's used to Australian shot sizes where they measure it out and it's already a little bit smaller, so those 2 shots would have been 2 shots. But we had a very generous pourer who didn't really measure, and when she poured 1 shot, she put it to the side and kept pouring, so he essentially had 2 doubles. So 4 shots of Jack instead of 2. Even though alcohol laws are still pretty strict in America, they're not as strict when it comes to pouring and whatnot. They don't measure as tightly as they do over here in Australia. So it's very common if you go over there and order just say a gin and tonic, you're not just going to get that regular shot of gin that you would get in an Aussie pub. You're going to end up with a shot and a half, probably 2 to 2.5 shots worth of actual alcohol in your drink. American drinks do end up being quite a bit stronger because of this. Obviously, you are going to find a couple places over there that sort of water the alcohol down a little bit, which is unfortunate. But shot for shot, typically American drinks do end up being a little bit stronger than Australian drinks, at least when you're talking about mixed drinks and cocktails. Now, this one I actually touched on a little bit over on Ashley Faye Vlogs. We did talk about this, and that is not feeling as safe in America as I do over here in Australia. Even in Hawaii, which is much more relaxed, it has a lower crime rate, a lower homicide rate than Philly does, which is where I grew up. There was still this occasional feeling of unease, especially when certain people would come up to us to talk on the street. There was one issue in particular where I felt very unsafe. Just an overall intuition, gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. This guy came up to Mark and asked for a smoke, and Mark said he didn't have any on him. So he kept talking to this guy who come up to us, and I'm sitting there waiting for our Uber, looking at my phone, counting down how long until the Uber gets there, getting a little bit closer to Mark, hoping that he will cut off this conversation and basically just stop being friendly with the guy. Over here in Australia, it's very common for people to have conversations with strangers. If somebody comes up to you on the street and they ask for a smoke, they ask for a light, sometimes people have absolutely no problem continuing on a short little chit-chatty conversation. Over in the States, it's not very common and can actually be very unsafe. Luckily, at least, it was in broad daylight. I did have Mark with me. There were other people around us, essentially as witnesses, and it was in front of a very large shopping store. But overall, I didn't feel safe, and because you can't just tell somebody you're talking to, hey, don't talk to this person, that's not quite right, I don't feel good about this. It's going to end very poorly if you communicate that. I essentially just had to sit there and wait for our Uber to show up. Did anything happen? No, but it absolutely is not a conversation I would have continued if I was on my own. It's definitely not a conversation I would have continued back home in Philly, and honestly, in Philly, if Mark had tried to continue talking to a stranger at that point, I would have changed our location and told Mark we have to meet them down the street to get away from the other person. There is this feeling of not being safe, of having an extra sense of caution when you're talking to people you don't know over in the States. I know it does sound like an exaggeration, but in some cities you have to act like the other person might have a concealed weapon on them. That's absolutely a possibility over in the States. And growing up in a rough neighborhood in a large city with a large crime rate, I have this sense of caution when I'm talking to strangers, especially over in the States. And even though I haven't had that worry or that fear talking to anybody over here in Australia, in the States, even in some place as relaxed and laid back in Hawaii, that sense of fear and caution just bounced right back again. It's like a bowling ball just dropped into my stomach when this guy started talking to us. You have to trust your intuition when you're over in the States, because even if you're wrong about something like that, it's so much better to be safe than sorry. And even though I spent 30 years around this, it was a huge shock to go back to that and to feel those feelings again, even for something as small and simple as talking to a stranger for a couple minutes on the street. Now, this one was more for Mark than it was for me, but remembering to stay on the other side of the road when you're driving, or in our case, when you're riding a motorbike. So for Mark's birthday, we actually rented a motorbike, we rented a Harley. We took the road all the way out to Hana and then came back to Kihei, so it was probably about a 7-hour trip with a couple off and on stops. And it was a very long trip, it was a very long day, and one of the things that I think was a little bit tougher for Mark to remember, since he was the one who was actually riding, I was riding pillion on the back, is to stay on the right hand side of the road when you're driving in the States. Luckily, when you start off on the road, you're on a really large highway. You can kind of follow other people. But once you get onto the smaller streets or the side streets, it can be really, really easy for people who drive on the left-hand side of the road to go back to that left-hand side. It's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. You're so used to it that you have to consciously remember that you have to stay on the right when you are over in the States. For some people, it can actually be a huge struggle, especially if you're in a car where everything is on the opposite side of the car as well. The steering wheel, the brakes, gas, whatnot, everything is on the opposite side. At least with the motorbike, if it's consistent across countries, you don't have to worry about a left-hand side of the road motorbike versus a right-hand side road motorbike. They're all the same, luckily, so that was a little bit easier for us, especially for Mark, who's used to driving on the left-hand side of the road. But remembering to stay on the right-hand side, especially when you come up to those smaller streets, especially when you're turning onto a side street or you're going onto a street where there's no other cars and you have to consciously remember to stay on that side, especially for such a long drive like we had, can be really tough. It's a little bit exhausting after a while. It's definitely a little bit tricky for some people to remember to drive on the other side of the road when they go over to the States. Now, this one was infuriating. Mark was so mad about this. And honestly, as somebody who's seen what happens during motorbike accidents, I'm not surprised that he's this angry at this. And that is that there is no law requiring helmets for adults in Hawaii. Now, this does vary between states, but the vast majority of states don't require adults to wear helmets on a motorbike or a motorcycle after 20 years old. There are some states that require it, but they're actually in the minority, not the majority. And Hawaii is one of those states where I think after you're 18 or older, you don't have to wear a motorbike helmet once you're on a motorbike or a motorcycle. We saw so many people who were riding without helmets. It was probably like a 3-to-1 ratio of people who weren't wearing helmets to people who were. And yes, even though it's hot and it's bulky, honestly, these helmets do save lives. They save people from getting really bad head injuries, traumatic brain injuries. And yes, if you want to be broad and talk about how it could be related to the fact that the Australian healthcare system is a public system, so everybody pays into it, so they want to make sure people are as safe as possible, you guys can get into that if you want in the comments. But talking about what it's like over in America, it's so shocking to see that people don't have the common sense to do something as simple as wear a freaking helmet. Like, it's not that hard. It's not that complicated. You don't have to wear a full face-covered helmet. When Mark and I rented the little Harley that we went out on, we had those little half helmets that honestly don't really do too much as far as protection, but something is better than nothing. It didn't ruin our experience. It didn't put a damper on it at all, having to wear a helmet. Honestly, we're so used to it because we ride over here in Australia that it didn't really affect us at all. If anything, it felt weird not having a full face helmet. So going over to the States where helmets aren't a requirement was mind-boggling, especially for Mark, who's had a motorbike license for years, who grew up riding dirt bikes and whatnot, where helmets were always a legal requirement. And for anybody else who's out there who's a rider, filtering is actually illegal over in the States as well. So except for California, all other states, filtering between stop traffic is actually illegal. So there are some huge changes that Mark had to keep in mind, not just driving on the other side of the road and seeing other people who weren't wearing helmets, but also the fact that you can't filter. It's actually illegal, and it's something that he's so used to doing on his bike over here that he has to remember to pull back, that he can't do what he's used to doing over here in Australia, which is actually much safer and makes so much more sense. Now this one is very small, and it's something that honestly I didn't even notice until we went back in the States and Mark pointed it out. Some restaurants in the States don't use regular coasters. Either they won't give you anything or they will give you a napkin instead of an actual coaster. Over here, I can't remember the last time I went to a pub or a restaurant and they didn't give us an actual proper cardboard coaster to use whenever we ordered a drink. So it's going to vary in whatever restaurant you go to in the States, but don't be surprised if you go to a pub or a bar or someplace that's a little bit more low-key and casual and you just end up with a napkin on the bottom of your drink instead of an actual coaster, or sometimes they won't even give you anything to put under your drink. And this is something that shocked Mark more than it shocked me. I guess growing up with it, it didn't really occur to me how common this is. But the use of the single-use plastics over in the States is huge compared to Australia. I'm talking coffee cups, coffee lids, the little stirrers that they use for coffee. I'm talking about covering up plastic spoons and straws in little plastic slips that you then have to take off and throw away. And then you have this little plastic piece of silverware that you then have to throw away. There are so many single-use plastics that are used regularly over in the States. And even though there are some places that are starting to use things like paper straws or biodegradable silverware, it's still not that common over there yet compared to over here in Australia. You don't see plastic straws over here. It's so much more common to see things like biodegradable plates and cups and whatnot over here in Australia. Whereas over in the States, it's almost like they're still stuck 30 years in the past where everything is covered in plastic. Even their plastic is covered in plastic. So even though it was something I was used to seeing, for Mark it was a huge shock seeing just how much regular single-use plastic was used over in the States. We probably used as much as a week in Hawaii as we did in the 8 months that I've lived over here, to be honest. Granted, we were obviously going out to restaurants and cafes and whatnot more that 1 week in Hawaii, but 1 week as a tourist in Hawaii probably used as much single-use plastic as 2 people have used in the almost 9 months of living here in Australia. So this one I completely forgot about until I went back over to the States. In Hawaii, marijuana is legal for medical use only. It's not legal for recreational use like it is in some other states. But it is very, very common to walk down the street and smell it on people. It's very common to have a car drive by and see people smoking a joint and smell it coming out. Whereas over here in Australia, it's not nearly as common. I can count on one hand the number of times I've smelled it over here in Australia. Whereas over in Hawaii, I could count on one hand how many times a day I would smell it over there. So it's something where if you're not used to it, it's going to be a little bit of a shock walking down the street and smelling pot. Like, it's very, very common over in the States. And even though there are some slightly sketchier neighborhoods over here in Australia where it might be a little bit more common, typically it's not something that you're going to regularly smell out in the open like we did over in Hawaii. This is something I remember in Philly too. I remember walking around my neighborhood and some houses you just knew were the pot houses because every time you walked past it, you could smell it just pouring out from the windows, pouring out from the open front doors. You knew what houses were smoking. So a bit of a culture shock going from Australia back to the States and smelling that all over again. And this last one, it varies a little bit, obviously. We went over when the exchange rate was absolutely terrible, coming from Australia over to the States. So $1 American was $1.51 Australian. We went over when the exchange rate was probably at one of its worst levels in the last couple of years. And it's just unfortunate that does happen. You can't really predict what the exchange rate is going to be if you're planning a trip a couple months in advance. Obviously, when we booked our trip, it was about $1.40. We were hoping it would stay at about that level, but instead it got much worse. It was $1.51 Australian to $1 American. So things in the States not only were just expensive in general, especially being in Hawaii, which is a huge tourist destination that's trying to recover post-COVID, but the American dollar is so much more weighty than the Australian dollar over there. If we bought a $2 bag of chips American, it would cost us over $3 Australian. So overall, the exchange rate was very much against us the entire time we were over there. And when I was over here in 2019, the exchange rate was about $1.36 Australian for $1 American. And because it was coming from the States to Australia, it actually really worked in my favor. When I was bringing that little bit of savings that I had from the States over to Australia, when I moved over, the exchange rate was still very much in my favor, but going back over there and knowing that the Australian dollar was actually weaker than it was when I moved over here even just a few months ago, it was a little bit of a tough pill to swallow, especially when we were checking our bank statements and seeing just how much we spent over there, because we were looking at prices in American dollars. There's taxes to be added on. If we went out, there's tipping to be added on. So all that definitely did add up. It was very, very pricey going from Australia to Hawaii. So that's it for these little reverse culture shocks. What it was like as an American who moved to Australia, who went back to America and just returned to Australia. So I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, hit the like and subscribe button down below to join the little Amer-Australian family over here. I post on Mondays and normally Thursdays about the differences between American and Australian culture and the overall process of learning to live down under. My name's Kaitlyn, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!